Greetings! I'm Celine, welcome back to my channel, and I am one of the strange people who is learning Latin in the 21st century. You might be wondering why someone is learning a so-called dead language, a language that no longer has any native speakers, even though I would definitely reject the dead language label in the sense that there are still Latin speakers. To be fair, most of them are in the Vatican, but they do still exist. In this video, I'm just going to talk a little bit about Latin, why I'm learning it, some of the books that I read, some non-fiction that I read regarding the ancient classics, and also for people who might find that interesting, how I'm learning Latin. The first book that I finished this year was actually Long Live Latin, which is a book by Nicola Gardini, and I particularly love the subtitle, which is The Pleasures of a Useless Language. Gardini is a professor and he teaches and lives both in Oxford as well as Milan. And this book is his attempt to share his joy, his passion for Latin. And I started reading this book at a point where I'd already committed to my own little project of learning Latin, and I think I found this book at a perfect time. In the introduction, he sort of posits perhaps a two-pronged argument in favour of reading Latin. The first is that not everything needs to have a use. There's also so much in terms of there are many things in life that are the best things in life, basically, that aren't particularly useful. And things that Gardini talks about is, for example, beauty. Beauty doesn't have use, but it's still incredibly important. He also talks about freedom. And this ties into a broader idea that in modern society, we've basically become perhaps a bit too obsessed with optimization, with basically turning ourselves into productivity machines rather than focusing on human values, things like freedom, beauty, enjoyment, as well as rest. And secondly, he then argues that Latin is a beautiful language, that Latin is a gateway to think about important questions like, what is the meaning of life, and those kinds of things. So Gardini writes, for example, when he talks about the adjective beautiful, I mean to say that Latin is various, malleable, versatile, easy and difficult, simple and complicated, regular and irregular, clear and obscure, with multiple registers and jargons, with thousands of rhetorical styles, with a voluble history. Why give ourselves practical reasons for encountering beauty? Why impede ourselves with false arguments about comprehension? Why submit ourselves to the cult of instant access, of destination over journey, of answers at the click of a button, of the shrinking attention span? Why surrender to the willless, the superficial, the defeatists, the utilitarians? Why not see that behind the question, what's the point of Latin, perhaps posed unassumingly, rests a violence and an arrogance, an assault on the world's richness and the greatness of the human intellect? And while we can argue about some of the statements that Gardini makes about modern society, I think his point stands. I think the idea that every single thing we do needs to have utility, I completely reject that idea as well. I absolutely love just following my own passions and, do my friends make fun of me for learning Latin? Yes. But I think Gardini just has such a passion for the language, and I think this book conveys it really well, and it definitely made me feel much more excited about learning Latin. So a big part of this book is that he goes through a number of authors such as Catullus, Cicero, Ennius, Caesar, Lucretius, Virgil, Tacitus, Ovid, and Livy. And he goes through every author, and he takes quite a personal approach, so it is partially about his interaction with these texts, but I think he's very good at touching on what makes these authors interesting, what makes these authors people that are still being read 2,000 years onwards. Because I think it's not just the idea that, the Western world is built on Roman civilization or stuff like that. I think there is genuinely something about these authors that does still draw people in. You only need to look at, for example, how popular Stoicism has been over the last couple of decades, which is an ancient philosophy, but people do still find meaning in that. Another author that I think is really interesting in terms of the ancient classics is Mary Beard, and I recently read Confronting the Classics, which is subtitled A Provocative Tour of What is Happening Now in Classics, Learned, Trenchant and Witty. Mary Beard is probably one of the most famous classicists alive at the moment. And this is a collection of reviews that she wrote. So she writes for the Times Literary Supplement as well as some other places. where she reviews books about the classical world. Initially, I wasn't so sure whether I wanted to read basically a collection of reviews, but as I started to go through it, I realized that Confronting the Classics actually gives you a really interesting view into the conversations that are being had within classical studies. Admittedly, this is not a book if you have like no knowledge whatsoever of ancient Greece and Rome. Although I think in general Mary Beard, helps you place the time frames that she's talking about, and she does explain things, but I do think if you don't know the very basics of, just a grand overview of the timeline of the Roman Empire, how it rose, how it fell, how there used to be consuls, and just the general political structure, I think this book might be a bit confusing. But what Beard also shows is that the interpretation of the ancient classics is still ongoing. Like, it's not like, despite the fact that it's been thousands of years, it doesn't really feel like the last word has really been said. And part of that has to do with the fact that we do still find new things. There are still excavations going on, both in Italy as well as in Greece. So in terms of archaeological finds, we still discover new things. But even in terms of the literary texts, there is still very much to discuss. And I particularly enjoyed Beard calling out some classicists for basically extrapolating a little bit too much, or in other words, perhaps make stuff up. In terms of my own journey with Latin, I did take Latin during high school, so I had 6 years of Latin. However, as a high school student, I was an okay student, but I didn't put in necessarily a lot of effort. So despite the fact that we went to Rome, which I did really, really enjoy, I ended up not really remembering much of Latin as an adult. But since then, recently, I've been more interested in the medieval period. I've been more interested in just history in general. And because I have finished my PhD, which was on the 19th century in the UK, I found it really enjoyable to just explore different parts of history. And I think if you're really interested in history, I think the fact that you can still read texts that are thousands of years old, that we can still have an interaction with that text that can approximate the experience that someone has had such a long time ago, I think that is wonderful. So my goal with learning Latin is basically just to read historical texts, and that includes both ancient texts, so one of my goals is to read the Aeneid by Virgil, but I also really look forward to being able to read medieval Latin, which, although it has some idiosyncrasies, it is largely built on the classical model. I've also noticed that a lot of writers, even in the 19th and 20th century, because the classical education used to be such a big thing, I find that even to fully understand authors from those periods, it can be really helpful to have a lot more knowledge of the ancient classics. One of the biggest examples here, I would say, is Oscar Wilde. Wilde studied the classics first at Trinity and later at, I thought it was Oxford, but now I'm not sure, it could have been Cambridge. I read a little bit on an Oscar Wilde binge last year, and especially in his non-fiction, his poetry, there are so many classical allusions. So for me, learning Latin is also a little bit about perhaps sharing the same foundations with some of the authors that I really appreciate. And I feel like it would really further my understanding of them if I knew what things they are actually referring to. In order to get back into Latin, I originally followed a course which was from the Oxford Department of Continuing Education, which was the Latin beginners class, and I did both the first and the second semester of this. This video is not sponsored or connected to Oxford University whatsoever, but I found this course really helpful. It was completely online, it was 10 weeks for each semester. There was a pre-recorded session as well as a live session with a tutor, so we could, go through some exercises and ask questions. But having a bit more of a structured approach I thought was really helpful. The method we used was Reading Latin by Peter V. Jones and Keith C. Sidwell, and this method focuses on a lot of grammar, but it has quite strong reading components, so you're really reading adapted Latin basically from the very start. And you're immediately reading longer passages, so you're not just decoding a sentence or two. It does kind of feel like you're diving into the real thing, although very, very simplified from the very beginning. On the side, I've also been working through Lingua Latina per se illustrata, which is the absolute favourite of the online Latin communities. I think mainly because this is a book that you can work through without an instructor, so it's pretty self-explanatory. But I have to admit, I'm someone who quite likes the top-down method of learning a language through knowing the grammar, whereas this book takes a bottom-up approach. So it presents you with a lot of the language, and you basically learn the grammar through seeing it in action. I'm just someone who prefers someone to tell me, like, this is an irregular verb, that's just the way it is, rather than having to sort of guess the grammatical rules. You know, I don't really want to have to distill it from thousands of words. Just tell me and I will remember it. But what I really like about this is that it is completely written in Latin, and it becomes more and more difficult. So it introduces new vocabulary in every chapter. So I'm basically just using this as vocab practice, which is very helpful. So in terms of where I'm going with my Latin journey, at the moment, I feel like I'm just going to be working through these books, you know, learn more about the grammar. I would say I'm sort of halfway through working through the grammar. There's still a lot of grammar for me to learn before I can really dive into original material. But I would say that my journey learning Latin has been really lovely. I think there's something so wonderful about learning something that you're interested in and learning it just on your own steam. There are no deadlines or grades or things that I need to pass, or there's just absolutely no pressure, which I think is the absolute best way to learn. So that was just a little video about my connection with Latin, why I'm learning it, and some of the books I've read. I would love to know if you're learning something that other people think is useless, but that you just find incredibly enjoyable. I would love to know. Doesn't matter if it's a language or a skill or something else, I would love to hear it. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye!